Hello there. I've just finished The Last of Us Part 2. I put the last episode up. This was about 3-4 days ago. I've given myself some time to think about what happened in Part 1 and Part 2 because I want to look forward to what I would like to see in Part 3. Is there going to be a Part 3? I think there is. I think the interest is very high in the franchise. Parts 1 and Part 2 were phenomenally successful. The TV series looks like it's going to be the same. There is going to be a massive interest in a proper Part 3. I'm not talking about the online factions version, which is, credit to those people who like online play. Very interesting for them, I'm sure. I used to be a big online player myself, but I've since moved off that and now prefer the sort of single player experience. If there's going to be a Part 3, and I think there is going to be a Part 3, what's going to be in it? So, firstly, I am in two minds about whether Abby and Ellie will feature. Here is why. I think to some degree their stories have closed. Ellie's story has reached the point where she's realised that revenge is ultimately futile and pointless. It achieves nothing and it comes with great cost. This is a revenge story in part. It's also about how people change because of the things they are forced or compelled by their minds to do. Ellie's now, lost 2 fingers as a result of what she did. She has this permanent physical reminder. She has the mental scars that she's still carrying around. She's lost Dina. She's lost, to a degree, Tommy, because, he is now crippled, blinded in one eye, bitter, a different man to the person he could have been, separated from Maria. She's lost many of her friends who she met along the way. She lost Joel, obviously. You could argue that Ellie had choices and that many of the things that she had happened to her and the things that she suffered and the losses are down to poor choices on her part. You could argue that, given who she was, many of those choices weren't choices at all. She committed herself to a path of action, and then subsequently that simplified choices when they presented themselves to her because she just basically followed that path. So I think Ellie's story may be over. Abby's story, similarly, I think, is finished. She started out as one sort of person. She was affected badly by the death of her father. She became a different sort of person. She met Lev and Yara. She changed again. But now I think the Abby we see is the Abby we get. I think this is the true Abby, the one who's been left at the end of Part 2. The one who basically wants peace. The one who wants to care for someone. She's found Lev, who's lost his mother, lost his sister, and I think there's a kind of family evolving there. So you can imagine this situation where Abby and Ellie go their separate ways, never do the two meet again, and they live out their lives separately and end off. However, let's imagine a situation where their storylines don't end. How could that possibly happen? Well, it's not going to be about revenge because that's gone. They've agreed between them. Abby did not want to kill Ellie anymore. She said, keep out of my way and I'll leave you alone. Subsequently, they did meet. She didn't kill Ellie. Ellie didn't kill Abby when the time came. She didn't do it. You might be thinking, and some people did, some people said, that it was Joel's death which ruined Part 2. That's an entirely fair opinion for people to have. Everyone's entitled to think what they wish. I think Joel's death didn't actually remove Joel from the story. Joel in flashback, Joel in dreams, Joel in memories that came to Ellie at pivotal moments, including the point at which she was about to kill Abby, had a massive influence on what happened in the story. So to say, in my mind, to say that Joel wasn't in it, I didn't feel that. I felt Joel's presence all the way through Part 2. And it was a very clever mechanic in my mind to, although he was absent, make his effect on the storyline just as pronounced in its own way as if he'd been physically standing next to Ellie at various points and whispering in her ear what to do and what not to do. Going back to what I said at the start, are Abby and Ellie out of it? Are they not going to be part of part 3? The only instance I could come up with where they might be in a part 3 is this. How did the cordyceps virus, the cordyceps fungus, make the leap from affecting insects, whatever, to infecting humans? Did it happen simultaneously in lots of places, or was it confined to just the one place and spread very rapidly across the country and around the world for all we know? How did it happen? If it happened organically, if it was an act of nature, just part of, the development of the way that plants and things change over time, then that's one thing. Imagine it wasn't. Imagine it was in some way engineered by humans. It would be a formidable weapon if you could use it to infect people and effectively destroy your enemy and the enemy population without infecting and destroying your own population. For that to be the case, you'd have to have some way of inoculating your own population, your soldiers, to make them invulnerable to the cordyceps infection. But imagine that somehow, through an accident or malicious act, the engineered cordyceps was released before you had that inoculating agent. What you would see would be what happened in The Last of Us Part 1. An outbreak, rapid spread, deterioration, breakdown of society, no possible remedy, and chaos. Imagine Ellie or Abby got into their head that question: how did it start? Abby has a vested interest in finding out. Imagine they thought or got wind of or heard rumour or legend of some group of people or place where this may have first started. Abby's father died because of this, because of the existence of the cordyceps infection. If she traces back the root cause of her father's death, it wasn't Joel. Joel was the agent of her father's death, not the cause. The cause, right back to the beginning, is the cordyceps infection. So really, who Abby should be motivated to deal with, were she still motivated, are the people responsible for that first outbreak. How about Ellie? Indirectly, the existence of the cordyceps infection cost Joel his life. You may argue that Ellie and Joel would never have met had there not been the cordyceps infection. Sarah would still be alive. Joel would still have a daughter. But they did meet. Ellie and Joel did meet. And Joel did die. And it was because of the cordyceps infection. So Ellie, if she's looking for revenge, might be tempted, were she to hear the same rumour, legend about, how the thing had started in the first place, to seek out those responsible and deal with them. Now, you may argue that the lesson of, revenge is pointless, it's fruitless, it leads to nothing but hurt, harm, emotional loss, physical hurt, has been well told, and that is gone forever. But it was the existence of the cordyceps infection that propelled both Ellie and Abby into the courses of action that they took. It was the inciting incident, if you like. It wasn't the death of Joel, when you go back far enough. It wasn't the death of Abby's father. It was way before that point that all of this was kicked off. That, I think, could be, if the people who were, behind this were looking at continuing the story, that could be a very interesting mechanic. The existence of this group, these people who were responsible for it in the first place, could just propel our two main characters surviving from parts 1 and part 2 to become involved again. Would they be the central characters? Maybe, I don't know. But that was my thought. Now, the other option, of course, is that Ellie and Abby are not involved at all. Part 3 is not about them. All those storylines are closed off. No characters continue in a major role into part 3. So what on earth would part 3 be about? Well, I don't know about you, but you can't help but think, where do we go from here? If we assume the door is closed on everything that happened in part 1 and part 2, then it's a blank sheet. What hasn't been explored in part 1 and part 2 that could propel characters forward in part 3? One is this business of still needing to find a cure for the infection. All right, well, we know the scientists are motivated to try and find a cure. Altruistically, society as a whole wants to try and find a cure so that it can inoculate people, save their lives, and society can be rebuilt. That's not terribly exciting, is it? What else could be behind the search for a cure? Right, let's imagine. Let's play what if. The WLF and the Seraphites had an almighty battle in part 2, and let's imagine they essentially annihilated each other so that their forces are reduced to such small numbers they're not significant anymore in the story going forward. Okay. The Fireflies, of course, still exist. Well, we think they do. In small numbers. The Fireflies are a sort of middle ground group, aren't they? They're not as draconian as the WLF. They're not as religiously motivated as were the Seraphites. The Fireflies seem to be this hinterland group where they're in the middle. It's possible Abby continued her search looking for the Fireflies. It may be where she was heading off with Lev. Not immediately, but once they'd got their bearings again and had licked their wounds, it might be that she wanted to continue this idea that Owen had of finding Fireflies and settling down with them. So the Fireflies could still exist. Thinking about this business of who started the virus spreading in the first place, who else could be looking for immunity? Let's imagine a situation where, as we have at the moment, communications are poor. Right across the country, we don't know what's going on really on the far coasts, in the middle of the United States, in the far north or south. We have no idea. We only know really about Washington, Seattle, that sort of area. Let's imagine groups are replicated. That's not the only surviving group across the United States. There are other groups. Some of those groups will be less friendly than others, in the same way that the groups were in the Seattle area that we met. Imagine a situation where Ellie is not the only immune person. She said to Joel, how come we've not heard of anybody? How come we've never met anybody? How come no one's ever talked to us about having met someone, etc., etc.? And that's true, but their sphere of influence was quite limited. Their geographical explorations were small. Communications are poor across the country, certainly long-distance communications. So it's quite possible other groups exist and other immune people exist. There's an asterisk by that, because although Ellie was investigated in Salt Lake and they were going to operate and remove part of her brain to try and synthesize a vaccine, there was no guarantee that that would work or that the vaccine would prove effective at inoculating people. It was just their best shot at that point. They were exploring this idea of immunity. Imagine a malicious group somewhere else in the United States, also aware of the existence of immune people. wanting to get their hands on an immune person so that they could study them and synthesize from them a vaccine, but not for any altruistic purpose, not to give it to the entire population of what's left of the United States so that they're safe from the infected and safe from becoming infected themselves, but instead to use it to inoculate just their followers, to make them invulnerable to attack by the infected, to make it easy for them to go to places that would have been totally out of bounds to them before. Imagine further, I mean, we're playing what if, aren't we here? There's a way of harnessing the infected so that they can be directed. We had examples in part 1 and part 2 where infected could be chained up and used as guard dogs, if you like, where they could be left in particular areas to make it difficult to cross those areas. They were sort of like a trap, if you like, an animal trap. Imagine it was possible to harness the infected. Imagine it was possible to direct them in some way, to influence them, so you had an army of them. Again, this might appeal to some militaristic group somewhere, that they could have this legion of the undead, if you will, that could be an army to help them capture the rest of the United States if they wished. Similarly with the inoculation thing, if your people are inoculated, it makes them stronger. You've got a very heavy tactical advantage there. Imagine another possibility is that some group somewhere is working to make the cordyceps infection even more deadly, on top of getting hold of an immune person to inoculate their own troops and their own people. All of these things could be inciting acts. They could motivate, we don't know who these characters could be, other central characters in part 3, possibly immune people, possibly not immune people, possibly, I don't know, parents who've got a child who's immune. It's not necessarily the case that, Abby and Ellie, who found themselves very much orphaned, in a sense, have to be replicated in part 3. We don't have to have that situation. I think in my bones, it's got to be something like that. There's got to be a change to the status quo in the world. We know that the infected can evolve if they're kept in enclosed spaces like they were in the basement of Salt Lake City. We know that the spores struggle to survive in the outside world. Doesn't have to be the case in part 3. That could be a threat of its own. I think conflict is the basis of part 1 and part 2. It's a search for something. It's a search for peace. It's a search for an answer. It's about the way people change and are changed by the things that happen to them. But it's also about conflict. That nicely, I think, brings me into gameplay. Part 3, gameplay. Story is part of what it needs. Gameplay is the other part. Gameplay is perhaps slightly easier to tackle. The first thing I would say about a gameplay is please keep the hint system. I like the hint system. It worked extremely well. There were times when I got a little bit frustrated and was talking to the game and saying, come on, I need a hint here, I need a hint here. But before long that hint arrived. And I like it. I have played other games that do not employ a hint system, and it can be intensely frustrating if you think that you've done everything you can possibly do and you still can't puzzle something out. You still can't work out, how do I get out of this area? What's it asking me to do? Where's the exit? Where's the entrance? What is the object I'm meant to be manipulating, gathering, using? I just can't see it. Some people may say, well, you're not looking hard enough. But the fact is, that presupposes that, you've got every possible idea in your head of what the answer could be. It's not always the case. Sometimes things literally do stump you, and it gets frustrating. frustration to a point is good, because it motivates you to look harder, to see better, to try things you haven't tried. But also frustration can compound and become fatiguing and tiring if it happens repeatedly. So please, I would say, part 3, keep the hint system. Don't change it. I think it worked extremely well just at the level it was at. What else? Difficulty options. I think the existence of easy is very important. As someone who, when he gets hold of The Last of Us Part 1, the read-made version, which at the moment is just about impossible at anything other than full price, and this is months after it was released, I would try the harder levels based on the fact that I learned a lot by playing in the easy mode. There were times when the easy mode for me was essential. There were various occasions where the enemy was pretty hard to beat. Some of the bosses, if you like, boss fights, were just about at my extreme comfort level, let's put it that way. Maybe it's because I'm older, maybe it's because, as I've said before, my reactions aren't quite what they used to be. When you're 20, your reactions are one thing. When you're nearer 70 than 60, your reactions are something else. It could be that. It could simply be that it's a more pleasant experience playing where you feel you have a reasonable chance of success at whatever the game throws at you. So difficulty levels, please keep the same. Please keep the option to change the difficulty levels, because I think that's important too. Again, I've played games where this is not the case, where you start off in a particular difficulty and you're basically locked into it, and you can regret that decision to be brave. It's okay to be brave as long as you know you have a fallback, that you can make things a little bit easier for yourself where you need to. One thing I would say is about boss battles, I'm not asking for them to be simple. There's nothing wrong with them being challenging. There's nothing wrong with dying. I cannot remember how many times I died in The Last of Us Part 1, Last of Us Remastered rather, and Last of Us Part 2, but it must go into the hundreds. There were some sections where I died repeatedly. I think probably 15, 20 in one particular place was my limit. Boss battles come in two flavours, don't they? It's the sort of individual boss, but it's also sometimes the environment and the number of enemies in that particular area which can constitute a sort of boss, if you like. I wouldn't ask for them to be changed. One change I would like to see is, if you've made, say, 10 attempts at a particular enemy, I would like the game to offer you the option to skip that particular encounter. Now, there'll be people throwing their hands up in horror and saying, you can't do that. People would be using it all the time. Would they? I think I can only think of one occasion in the whole game, and it was probably that one where I died 15 or 20 times and had to edit it out, where I thought to myself, I'm not actually getting any better here. I've reduced it to the easiest level. I'm dying repeatedly because either I haven't quite got the level of skill that it's asking for, or I'm making the wrong decisions, or a combination of both. But after about 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes of doing that, then the option to skip it I think would be useful. Why do I say that? Because I don't think games should ever be about progression being based on your ability to beat a particular boss. Ultimately, it's absolutely fine for progression to be based on beating the boss, as long as there is an option somewhere for you to say, okay, I've had enough of that. I'm not getting any better. I'd like to move on, please. I think that option is important. And again, I've played many games where this option does not exist. And in the case of some games, certainly, it's why I stopped playing them, because the enjoyment factor decreased rapidly in situations where you thought to yourself, I've enjoyed it immensely up to this point, I am not enjoying this. And games should be enjoyable. They should be fun. It's fine for them to affect our emotions. It's great that they make us think about things we perhaps would not like to think about, and see, things acted out that we find distasteful or that make us recoil in horror. Absolutely fine. Nothing wrong with that at all. It's part of, the maturity of gaming. However, gaming should be enjoyable. And I think that's just a simple change. I'm not going to labour it anymore. That would make it possible for a wider range of people who are more interested in story than getting good at physical actions and gameplay, to the degree where no boss is a great challenge, and the easy level isn't where they live all the time. Not everyone wants that. I mean, I'm going to try it on hard next time I try it, but I've completed it on easy. And that's the confidence that I have to try it on a harder level. If I'd tried it on hard, or if, the hard level had actually been the easy level, if you get what I mean, so that the difficulty of easy was actually the difficulty of hard, I think I would have been discouraged many times over in various situations, and I may not have completed the game. I may actually have said to myself, you know what? Time to try something else. Time to try something more enjoyable. I never got to that stage, but important, I think, to have an option, a way of getting past blocks, impasses, points in the game where you've tried your best, you've spent a long time on it, and you don't seem to be making progress. So that's something. I like the idea of chapters, and I want part 3 to have chapters. The length of chapters, I think, is a thing. I would prefer more and shorter chapters than fewer and longer ones. And I think some chapters, the length of some chapters, can be disproportionately long compared to others. And it would be nice in a way to even those out more. I'm not suggesting a sort of rigid hour long for each chapter, but as someone who made a series about The Last of Us Remastered and a series about The Last of Us Part 2, I can tell you now, it was difficult at times to know when to stop. If you don't know the story, and I didn't know the story, then you don't know where the logical stopping points are. You've got to try and decide them by what just feels right. And sometimes I got it correct, and sometimes looking back at the story, I got it quite wrong. An episode that ran on for 2 3/4 hours is a very long episode. And if I were watching an episode of that length that someone else had done, I think I'd need to break that up to watch it. And to me, that's an indication that as the player, breaking it into more bite-sized chunks, if you want, is more palatable in terms of gameplay. And I say that because when you sit down to play the game, you don't always have a period of 2 or 3 hours of concentrated gameplay that you can afford to give. Sometimes you literally want to sit down and play for 30 minutes or play for 90 minutes and no more than that. Or, be able to stop at a sensible point and feel like the story is at a sensible point when you stop. If you compare it to, for example, watching a box set on TV, then that's the kind of experience in terms of breaking up chapters that I think you should find when you're playing a game. That there should be this regularly expected and evenish point at which it's sensible to stop. So, chapters, please keep them, but can we try to change them in their duration so that they make more sense for people, to be able to stop and feel like they've got a regularity to it, so that they know when they start playing anytime there's going to be a sensible place to stop after a particular amount of time. Not going on and on and on and on and on, and thinking, when am I going to get to a place where I can stop? Which happens. I'm again looking at my notes. I like the idea that you can play as multiple characters. In part 2, I actually enjoyed playing as Abby as much as I enjoyed playing as Ellie. I actually think, had you played that entire game through as Ellie, it might have got a little bit sameish. In that, she essentially set out with a purpose at the beginning of the game and continued with that purpose all the way through the game. So you kind of knew all along, where we were going to go as a destination. That didn't happen because not only did they make us play as Abby, but we had this chronological jumping around in time where backstory explained and gave context to the feelings, motivations and actions of the characters in the present part of the story. At times, I found the chronological jumping backwards and forwards a little bit confusing. I had to keep reminding myself, oh right, this was 4 months ago, this was 2 years ago, this was 4 years ago, this was 3 years ago. This is happening at this point in the story for Ellie, but this point in the story for Abby. It was at its limit, I think. Had it been any more choppy, I think there would have been a distinct probability that I would have lost the thread, at least in part, going through. And there were times when I had to remind myself, and I had to look back and say, oh, hang on a minute, when is this? Is this... oh right, this is before she did that, but after she did this. Or, okay, so Ellie's doing this at this point, and she's already been to this location, which is why Abby can see this, which is... it gets a little bit convoluted. So what I'm saying is, by all means have this multiple character play, by all means have this flashback element to it, which gives a richer understanding of the characters and teaches us about them and gets us to start thinking more deeply about their motivations and what they're likely to do as we move towards the middle and end of the story. But keep those reminders clear. And I actually think, and I've thought deeply about this one, we kind of knew what was going to happen to Mel and Owen before it happened to Mel and Owen. And as well as giving a sort of sadness when you went back into the storyline and thought, oh, you two are doomed, which was quite interesting, this idea of a doomed relationship, it also acted as a sort of spoiler within the story. And it made you think that some of the decisions that the characters were making were pointless because we knew they were going to not have anywhere to go. That they were, the plans they were making were never going to come to fruition. The idea that they were going to have a successful and happy life together was never going to happen. And we kind of played through that bit of the story as if it was a memory rather than actually playing through part of the story. It was as if the lesson that we were going to learn from it could have been summarised very quickly. The point where Abby cheated on herself, in a sense, by sleeping with Owen, cheated on Mel. There was always this feeling that, it was going to be found out. We kind of knew Mel and Owen's life in the story was limited. We knew that really we were looking at what was happening with Mel and Owen because of the effect it would have on Abby. And that was the only reason it was there. So, chronology-wise, get the word out, chronology-wise, I think part 3 should employ the same sort of flashback, the same sort of foreshadowing, if you will. But I think it's got to be kept clear. It's got to be realistically simple to follow as the player. It's okay to confuse the player. It's okay to confound the player. It's okay to lead the player up a path and have them start wondering whether they've done the right thing as the character. That's absolutely fine. But juggling all those chronology balls in the air at the same time and trying to remember where you saw this and who said this to that and where this person's relationship with that person is at this particular point in time, that's got to be kept really clear, I think, in part 3, because it's the story which is the thing. That's it. That's all I've thought about. I say that's all I've thought about. It filled a sheet and a half of narrow line paper with bullet points of things I wanted to talk about and mention. When part 3 comes out, I wonder how it will be received. Part 2 divided the community, and I think everybody would accept that. I think it was predictable. I think before it was even published, it was predictable that by playing as Abby and Ellie, it would have this effect. Part 3. Just to finish off, let's look at where we are in this world that's been created. It's quite a believable world, isn't it? 20 years ago, the outbreak happened. Many people were infected. Many people died. 20 years later, there are still many infected out there and people being infected all the time and dying. I get the feeling humanity is not replacing its numbers as fast as they're dying. Nothing has really changed. We don't have a cure. We don't have, as far as we know, many groups who are in the process of looking for a cure. We don't know anyone apart from Ellie who might even be considered to be immune and the source of a cure. Humanity seems mostly concerned with fighting amongst itself, with all these different factions that we've encountered, the Fireflies, the Seraphites, the WLF, the Hunters, etc, etc. If there's going to be any kind of future for humanity, part 3 has got to tackle, right at its core, progressing towards some sort of solution. Some sort of way of making the humans who are left invulnerable to infection. Some kind of way of dealing with the infected who remain. Maybe engineering some sort of new germ that just affects the infected and can be released. It could kill them all out. Who knows? We need to have a powerful motive behind the story in part 3. But the motive has to be about people, because the success of parts 1 and 2 were that we got to know these people who seemed quite believable and realistic. People who had desires, fears, motivations, wants, needs, the usual things that drive all human beings wherever they are, but sharpened into focus by the deadly danger of the environment and the threat it posed to them. If part 3 can successfully produce a motivation for characters that's as believable as the one that Ellie and Joel and Abby had in parts 1, part 2, then I think part 3 will be a great success. It's bound to be popular. There are many people who think The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2 were the best of a particular genre that they've ever played. I certainly think, and I've played a lot of games, I certainly think in its way The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2 are unique, and they are extremely good and have a high replayability value, which obviously contributes to the price that people pay for them. I hope part 3 has a similar level of involvement for players, that they can buy into the storyline and the characters in such a way that, when you go out there and spend your hard-earned money to buy the game, you actually think to yourself when you're in the process of playing, yes, this was all worth it. It's a rich, rewarding experience, and I'm glad and playing The Last of Us Part 3. That's it. I've rambled on there for maybe 40 minutes, something like that. I will miss The Last of Us Part 1 and The Last of Us Part 2. I have said already that when I get The Last of Us Part 1, the PS5 remake, I will play it through for myself on hard, on a higher level of difficulty. I doubt I shall make a YouTube series for it unless there was a bunch of people who in the comments said, yes, please do. We'd like to see you try and tackle it on hard. We'd like to see the difference that the remade version has graphically and, you know, in mechanics of some parts of the game like crafting and whatever compared to the others. In which case, obviously, I would think about doing that too. But I want to end by saying, as I did at the end of part 24, thanks ever so much for being part of the journey with me. I hope you enjoyed it. I apologise if at times I was not very good, or indeed rubbish. What can I say? You can only play to the best of your ability, can't you? But I hope, you know, watching me struggle and hearing my commentary through it at least gave you a smile from time to time, because I'm going to go full circle here and say the most important thing about any part 3 that comes out is I want it to be fun. We've got to be able to enjoy it. That's the bottom line. Okay, that's it. So thanks again, and I'll see you soon on whatever game I take up playing next. Bye.